Cameron Westbrook sat in his CEO office, with a brilliant light streaming through large glass windows reflected off expensive red carpets and lavish decorations. No one could deny that he was the epitome of a successful entrepreneur. From a boy born into a poor family in a small town, Cameron had built Westbrook Technologies, a billion-dollar tech empire. He was admired not only for his shrewd business strategies, but also for his leadership talent, his ability to forge relationships, and his conquest of the toughest markets. But behind that perfect facade, beneath the warm golden light of the office, lay a different story, a story Cameron never shared, a story he himself had never dared to fully confront. Westbrook Technologies was not just an innovative company. It was a place where every computer, every software, and every new technology harbored secrets. And those secrets were not the fruits of creative effort, but the products of deceit and corruption. Beneath the glossy surface of this tech empire, poor workers, especially black workers, toiled in deplorable conditions, without fair wages or even basic safety assurances. It all began with the tough decisions Cameron had to make when he first started the company. To build Westbrook Technologies from nothing, Cameron sought out major investors, those who could pour money into his projects. But the price of their support went beyond reasonable financial terms or standard contracts. His earliest backers were big names in the oil and mining industries, individuals embroiled in major environmental lawsuits. To secure their funds, Cameron had sold his soul, promising to help them tap into lucrative markets in impoverished regions. As the company grew, Cameron realized the cost was an irrational blindness to the plight of his colleagues, employees, and even the surrounding communities. He didn't just invest in technology, he invested in regions with no labor protections. He chose to build factories in poor countries where the workforce was predominantly black and where labor standards were virtually non-existent. The labor market there was dirt cheap, and that was why Cameron and his investors saw exploiting workers in these nations as the perfect strategy to maximize profits. With each contract signed, Cameron sank deeper into a haze of power and ambition. The cries of exploited workers never reached his ears, or if they did, they were addressed only superficially. Back then, Cameron wasn't a bad person. He was simply focused on the greater good of the company, his career, and the numbers. He believed that if the company thrived, if it grew strong, the world would tip its hat in respect. And that was the trap of lofty ideals built on lies. However, life wasn't always so simple. Meetings with investors were no longer just casual talks about technological potential or market expansion strategies. They grew complex and tense as financial fraud cases, rumors of worker mistreatment, and corrupt contract dealings began to surface. Once, during a critical meeting with a major European investor, Cameron faced a pointed question from the man across the table. Cameron, are you aware that your company is being accused of labor rights violations in factories across Africa? The man's gaze was sharp. It was a question Cameron never wanted to answer. He deflected, brushing aside the criticism and pushing the company's growth forward. He knew that if he didn't, everything he had built would collapse. But the signs of trouble were unavoidable. Reports from human rights organizations and international media investigations began to spread. Increasingly, Cameron's shadowy ties to powerful figures in the governments of poor nations came to light. Workers stripped of their rights, confined to labor zones without basic living standards, started to resist. They could no longer endure it. Yet Cameron couldn't stop. He had grown accustomed to a life of power, and the short-term gains greed brought him. His company expanded, and he was hailed as a visionary founder. But Cameron himself failed to see that his empire rested on lies, flawed decisions, and a foundation of deceit. Only when the truth began to flood in, a truth no one could hide, did he realize that his empire was on the brink of collapse. That night, the atmosphere at the charity gala hosted by Cameron Westbrook was nothing short of a grand celebrity affair. Crystal chandeliers cast a sparkling glow, reflecting warm golden light onto expensive gowns and formal tuxedos. Soft classical music filled the air, while elegant tables laden with exquisitely arranged food were tirelessly served. Under the admiring gazes of investors, entrepreneurs, and influential figures, Cameron stood at the center, both the host of the event and a masterful performer in the world of power. But amid the lively chatter and laughter, Cameron felt an inexplicable weariness. These superficial relationships, these hollow compliments, all of it had become tedious and meaningless. Since dedicating himself to his work, he had always chased new opportunities, seeking fulfillment in power and wealth. Yet now, surrounded by shining stars, he felt like a solitary ghost, out of place in this world. At that moment, a petite figure appeared on the fringes of the room. A black woman, dressed in a simple yet elegant gown, stood quietly in a corner. Her gaze didn't wander to the boisterous conversations around her, but fixed straight ahead, as if searching for something profoundly important. Cameron noticed her for the first time in the crowd and sensed something different about her. Though she didn't stand out like the other glamorous women, her quiet presence, like an unspoken invitation to curiosity, drew him in irresistibly. An intense, almost inexplicable urge compelled Cameron to approach her. He wasn't sure exactly what he was doing, but her gaze, as if forming an invisible connection, pulled him toward her. With a polite smile, he stepped closer and spoke softly. "Hello, I'm Cameron Westbrook. I don't think we've met before." The woman looked up at him, her eyes sharp, as if piercing through the polished exterior Cameron had crafted. She gave a faint smile, neither overly warm nor entirely cold. "I know who you are," she said calmly. "You're the man who built the Westbrook Empire, aren't you?" Cameron couldn't hide his surprise. She knew him, which meant she wasn't just another face in the crowd. He smirked, proud of his fame, but her gaze didn't allow him to bask in that arrogance. "I'm Jasmine Riley," she continued, "and I'm not a fan of people like you." Jasmine was a slender woman, but her eyes held a latent strength, like a smoldering fire ready to consume everything around it. Her gentle, composed demeanor couldn't conceal the sharpness and resolve in her words and gaze. She was a social activist who had risen to fight for the rights of exploited workers in the factories Westbrook Technologies had built in impoverished nations. She was not one to be swayed by the glittering allure of the elite world Cameron represented. Before Cameron could respond, Jasmine pressed on, her voice soft yet cutting, like an unveiling of truth. "Do you know how many lives your company has indirectly destroyed? How many families have lost loved ones because of the horrific working conditions in the factories you built? You're not a savior, Cameron. You're just someone who got rich off other people's suffering." Cameron froze. Jasmine's words hit him like a splash of cold water, but his pride and instinct to defend himself quickly filled the void of shock. He gave a faint laugh, not because he agreed with her, but because her challenge made him feel the need to protect what he had built. "This is a charity event," he said coolly. "Surely you didn't come here to start trouble, did you?" Jasmine's expression didn't waver. She replied calmly, "I came here for my own reasons, and I don't intend to do anything to you, at least not yet." She emphasized "not yet" with a subtle, mocking edge. The tension in the air grew palpable. Jasmine's words were not just criticism. They carried the weight of a warning. She hadn't come merely to accuse Cameron. She was there to expose the dark secrets he didn't want to face. This confrontation was more than a meeting between two people with clashing ideals. It marked the beginning of a battle, not just between individuals, but between forces of power, buried secrets, and undeniable truths. As the gala drew to a close, Cameron couldn't shake Jasmine's piercing gaze from his mind, a look that saw through the layers of armor he had constructed. She wasn't like the others. She didn't bow to money or power. And in that very gaze, Cameron realized there was something about himself, about what he had done and what he stood to lose, that he had never fully understood. This encounter was no mere coincidence. It was the starting point of a challenging journey Cameron could not escape. And Jasmine, the woman standing there with unwavering resolve in her eyes, would be the one to guide him toward a truth he could no longer run from. Cameron Westbrook couldn't forget that evening. Ever since meeting Jasmine Riley at the charity gala, her words echoed relentlessly in his mind. Though he tried to avoid them, to push them aside, the truth she brought forth refused to be ignored. Sleepless nights plagued him, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the impoverished workers his company had abandoned. Names never mentioned, stories never told. Guilt began to seep into his conscience, an uncomfortable sensation that neither money nor power could extinguish. Cameron decided he could no longer sit idly by, merely listening to criticism. He had to uncover the truth, to clarify what lay hidden behind the successes he had achieved. He called one of his longest-serving managers, a man he trusted. "Richard," he began, his voice firm yet tinged with unease, "I need you to do this immediately. I want all the records on our manufacturing plants and the working conditions of employees in poor countries, and the contracts we sign with partners there, as soon as possible." Richard, an influential figure in the company and ever loyal to Cameron, didn't fully grasp the reason behind this request, but didn't dare object. He took the call and promised to get started right away. Meanwhile, Cameron couldn't stop thinking about Jasmine's words. She wasn't just an ordinary activist. She was sharp and deeply aware of what was happening. Though he hated to admit it, deep down, Cameron began to doubt the very empire he had built. The next day, Richard delivered a thick stack of documents to Cameron. Reports on factories in poor nations, contracts, and even investigations that had been conducted. Cameron flipped through each page, each report, and with every word he read, a chilling realization washed over him. Everything Jasmine had said was true. One report revealed that Cameron's company had been involved in a massive financial fraud. They had signed contracts with the governments of poor nations to build manufacturing plants, but failed to adhere to any labor standards. In reality, they forced workers to toil in appalling conditions, without health insurance, basic rights, or wages that matched the cost of living in those areas. Some workers were made to labor for hours in unlicensed factories, where safety regulations were completely ignored. This wasn't just a minor violation, it was a systematic web of exploitation. Even more shocking, Cameron discovered that in their investment deals, his company had made under-the-table agreements with financial institutions to conceal illegal expenditures. These funds had been funneled into resource extraction projects in unregulated countries, where the company could manipulate working conditions without scrutiny. The vast profits from these deals had fueled Westbrook Technologies' global expansion, but they had also perpetuated a racist system, treating black workers as cheap, disposable tools, stripped of rights and dignity. Cameron sat motionless, unable to believe what he was reading. He had once taken pride in the empire he'd built, but now, looking back, he saw only betrayal. The staggering profits he had earned, the successes he had celebrated, all came at a cost. But it wasn't the cost he had imagined. Each report was a blow to his mind. He thought of the workers he had never met, those who had sacrificed their health and lives to provide the cheap labor his company exploited. These people had no voice, no one to protect them. They were ghosts in the factories, names never recorded, and all they received in return was a pittance, insufficient to support their families, headaches from lack of health care, and endless days of work without rest. The worst revelation was the company's ties to politicians in those nations. Westbrook Technologies had collaborated with corrupt officials who allowed resource exploitation without adhering to environmental or labor regulations. These contracts were signed without oversight, all for a single purpose: profit. When Cameron finished reading the documents, he felt as though a tidal wave had crashed over him, pulling him into a dark abyss with no escape. He had built an empire on fraud, lies, and exploitation. Everything he had done now felt like a double-edged sword, slicing through the trust he once had in himself. He resolved to face the truth, to acknowledge his mistakes. But that was only the first step. The real challenge was to fix what had happened, to steer his company back onto the right path. But was there still a chance to change? Jasmine's words echoed in his head once more. "You're not a savior, Cameron. You're just someone who got rich off other people's suffering." Cameron knew that to save his empire, he would have to pay a steep price. But that price wasn't just financial. It was the sacrifice of everything he had held dear for so many years. The truth had been laid bare, and now nothing could hide what had transpired. Each morning, Cameron Westbrook woke up feeling as though he were trapped in a gilded cage. Everything around him was too perfect. Mornings bathed in brilliant sunlight from his high-rise office, the ringing phone bringing calls from strategic partners, and bright financial reports. But no one knew that behind those gilded walls, a fierce battle raged within Cameron's mind, showing no signs of ceasing. The truth he had just uncovered about the deplorable working conditions in the factories his company owned, the exploitation of labor, and the illicit dealings with politicians could not be erased. Guilt didn't just haunt him. It made him feel that everything he had done over the years was like a castle built on sand. He had once been proud of his empire, but now, looking back, he saw only ruins. Cameron's struggle wasn't just external, not confined to strategic meetings or confrontations with industry rivals. The real battle was within him, as his conscience condemned his own actions. He could continue living in deceit, maintaining this empire with its safety and power, or he could stand up and face the mistakes he had made. That question lingered in his mind through long, sleepless nights. Cameron didn't know where to begin. He called Richard, the person he trusted most in the company, a man who had been with him since the early days. "Richard," he started, his voice hoarse with exhaustion, "I need everything to change. We can't keep going like this. It has to stop now." Richard didn't understand, nor could he comprehend the sudden shift in Cameron's decisions. They had gone too far, crossed boundaries from which there was no return. The company had become a symbol of wealth, power, and success. Yet now, all of that only left Cameron feeling empty. That night, he sat silently in the darkness, lost in thought. He gazed out the window at the city lights twinkling below, but in his mind, there was only a thick, oppressive shadow. The next day, he resolved to act. He called Jasmine Riley, the woman he couldn't forget since that fateful night at the gala. She had opened his eyes, forcing him to confront what he had avoided. He knew that if he did nothing, he would remain trapped in a life of lies, unable to redeem his conscience. When Jasmine met Cameron at his office, there was no glamour or politeness like in their previous encounters. This time, Cameron's seriousness and determination were unmistakable. "I need your help," he said, no longer the confident man at the peak of his career, but someone standing before the most critical choice of his life. Jasmine looked at him, her gaze as sharp as ever, though this time there was a hint of softness in her eyes. "I know what you're thinking," she replied, "but remember, what you've done can't be undone in a day. Change is never easy, and if you truly want to do what's right, you'll have to sacrifice everything. You built this empire on deceit and other suffering. Are you ready to give it all up and start over?" Cameron stared at her, feeling a heavy weight pressing down on his shoulders. He had once believed he could control everything, that he could shape a world where power and money were the only measures of worth. But now, he realized nothing could by a clear conscience. Every step he had taken left a dark mark. He could rebuild from scratch, but did he have the strength? Or would he retreat to the comforts of wealth, continuing to live in falsehood? Cameron decided he could no longer live as he had. He wouldn't let himself be driven by meaningless ambitions anymore. He began working with Jasmine to investigate and expose the company's wrongdoings. It was a grueling process, as Cameron faced the very allies who would not forgive his betrayal. Evidence surfaced one by one. Tense meetings unfolded in secret, and unforeseen dangers loomed on the horizon. With each passing day, Cameron's mood grew heavier. He knew there was no turning back, but the deeper he went, the more he felt the threats closing in. Confronting powerful figures in the company and navigating the investigation's harsh realities, Cameron never once faltered. He realized that to reclaim his conscience, he would pay a steep price, perhaps the empire he had built, perhaps the relationships around him. But no matter the cost, he had to do what was right. In the end, what Cameron and Jasmine uncovered was brought to light. His company wasn't just involved in corruption. It was part of a system of racism and worker exploitation. Evidence of shady financial dealings and illegal contracts was laid bare. Cameron's company crumbled in an instant, but at least he had done what he believed was just. Looking in the mirror, Cameron no longer saw a successful man draped in power. He saw someone who had lost everything, yet could finally sleep peacefully at night, knowing he had chosen the right path. The struggle of conscience wasn't easy, but it was the only road he could take. In the end, he understood that conscience was something neither money nor power could buy. Cameron Westbrook couldn't stop thinking about what he had uncovered in the past few weeks. After deciding to face the truth, he delved deeper into what he had built. But the dark reality wasn't just about corporate misdeeds or shady financial dealings. It was the profound racism embedded in what he had once considered a successful empire. With every step he took, every file he read, he realized that his empire wasn't forged from creative achievements or moral values, but from abuse and oppression. A system of racism thrived within the factories and business relationships his company maintained, an indispensable part of the wealth and power he had once prided himself on. In subsequent meetings with Jasmine, Cameron began to see that his actions didn't just affect poor workers in distant nations. They reflected a broader societal system where Black people and the impoverished were consistently mistreated and excluded from real opportunities for growth. Jasmine, with all her patience and resolve, kept pointing out the flaws in this system. "You're not just exploiting your workers," she said sharply. "You're upholding an unjust society where people like me, like them, never get a chance to change their lives. You think you're working for society's progress, but in reality, you're reinforcing a racist system without even realizing it." Cameron started to sense a connection between what he had done and what was unfolding in society. He saw the events and struggles he had ignored for so long. Waves of protest demanding rights, stories of racism and inequality seemed to exist right within his own company. The Black employees in the factories he had built weren't just treated poorly. They lived in a society where they had no voice, where every basic right was stripped away. He began reading more about the history of the regions where his company had established factories. He learned about oppressed communities, about families whose labor his company had not only exploited, but whose chances at a decent life had been stolen. He realized his decisions weren't just business errors. They were part of a long chain of actions perpetuating racism and societal injustice. He hadn't just built a company. He had helped solidify an unfair system that had persisted for generations. This became even clearer as Cameron and Jasmine started meeting real witnesses. They spoke with workers who had toiled in the company's factories, people stripped of their rights, treated as worthless tools. They told Cameron about endless hours in dangerous conditions, the lack of health protections, and the discrimination within Westbrook Technologies subsidiaries, where black workers were always assigned the hardest, least rewarding jobs. Some have been left to die in workplace accidents with no one held accountable. Cameron listened to their stories, but what pained him most wasn't just what they had endured. It was his own apathy over the years. He had known, yet he hadn't wanted to know. He had turned a blind eye, choosing silence over facing the truth. Now, as their stories crystallized in his mind, he couldn't escape the deep-seated guilt that gripped him. Meanwhile, Jasmine kept pushing Cameron further in his awakening. She didn't just want him to stop the exploitation. She wanted him to confront the societal consequences of his actions. She took him to impoverished areas where his company had indirectly robbed people of development opportunities. Filthy slums, desolate streets, and neighborhoods without infrastructure, where most residents were black people forgotten by society. These scenes made Cameron feel as if he were staring at a reflection of his own company, a system built on the foundation of racism, where the poor could never escape the trap of poverty they were ensnared in. Cameron began to understand that Jasmine was right. He had helped sustain a system of racism and injustice, not just within his company, but in society at large. His company, though it had created jobs and reaped enormous profits, had grown rich on the suffering of poor workers. These people had no rights, no protection, and were forever pushed to society's margins. This wasn't merely an economic issue. It was a matter of morality and human rights. Cameron couldn't stand by any longer. He resolved to do something to change it. He could no longer live in deceit or uphold such an unjust system. He had to face the oppressed workers, to confront the mistakes he had made. Cameron took action, not just to salvage his company, but to make amends to those harmed by the system he had unwittingly created. The process was far from easy. He faced fierce opposition from former allies in the company, those unwilling to embrace change. But Cameron couldn't turn back. He had decided to do what was right, and no matter the cost, he remained steadfast on this path. He knew the racist system he had helped perpetuate couldn't be dismantled overnight. But he also understood that if he didn't start with himself, if he didn't face the truth, nothing would ever change. Cameron Westbrook stood before a decision from which there was no retreat. What he had done, what he had built, was no longer the product of perseverance and skill he had once taken pride in. Instead, it was a submerged iceberg riddled with irreparable mistakes. He looked into the mirror, not to admire the face once bathed in the glow of success, but to confront the cold truth gradually revealing itself before his eyes. His encounter with Jasmine Riley had awakened something within him. His company wasn't merely a source of jobs. It was a colossal machine sustaining an unjust system, exploiting society's most vulnerable. But change didn't come easily. Cameron could recognize his mistakes. But how could he dismantle an entire system so firmly established over the years? Within the company, Cameron felt resistance from the insiders, those who had been with him since the early days of building Westbrook Technologies. These weren't just allies. They were the pillars upholding the empire he had created. They had once trusted and supported him, but now they saw hesitation in his actions, and it left them unsettled. Richard, the company's long-serving CFO and one of Cameron's most trusted confidants, didn't hide his disappointment during a private meeting after a week of reflection on recent events. Cameron, what are you doing? Everything we've built, everything you've created, are you going to destroy it all? Richard's voice was heavy, his eyes filled with concern. Cameron knew Richard was the only one who might understand him in this moment. They had worked together since the company was just a fledgling idea no one believed in. But now, as the truth began to surface, as the complexities of their business system were exposed, Cameron felt himself at a crossroads, and no one understood him better than Richard. Richard, I can't keep living with the cost of what I've done. The workers, the people who've suffered because of us, I can't ignore it anymore, Cameron replied, his voice lacking its former confidence, now laced with worry and regret. Richard looked at Cameron, silent for a moment. He could see his partner grappling not just with the outside world, but with himself. Yet in Richard's eyes, Cameron remained the leader, the one who couldn't simply abandon the power and empire they had built. I get what you're saying, but don't forget this company isn't just yours. Do you think you can change everything with one decision? We've gone too far, Cameron. Meanwhile, outside the company, Jasmine relentlessly urged Cameron to act swiftly. She knew change didn't come from one person alone. It required a revolution across the entire system. Jasmine wasn't someone who criticized without seeking solutions. She'd spent her life fighting for the oppressed. And now, seeing Cameron waver, she couldn't stop reminding him of the decision's weight. You can't just stand there hoping things will change. If you want to do what's right, you have to risk everything. You need to expose what's happening and stand up for those your company has robbed of their rights, Jasmine asserted, her gaze as piercing as ever. Cameron knew she was right, but within him raged a fierce conflict. He had once measured success by numbers, big contracts, lavish galas, and elite events. But now, facing the truth, he had to confront his own ego, the ego that had created a system he never imagined would spiral so far out of control. Finally, Cameron decided he would act. But it wouldn't be easy. He began by calling a meeting with the company's senior leadership, where all the insiders, those with the greatest influence, would have to face decisions they couldn't avoid. The meeting stretched on for nearly 4 hours. Arguments, clashing opinions, and objections filled the room without pause. The insiders couldn't accept the abrupt changes Cameron sought to implement. They looked at him, their longtime teammate, who had played a key role in their careers, and now doubted that such a decision would benefit the company. They were afraid, unwilling to lose power or sacrifice what they had built. Accusations of Cameron's weakness echoed relentlessly. Throughout the meeting, Cameron couldn't deny one thing. He was facing a power structure he himself had constructed. The companions who had helped him achieve everything now couldn't grasp the transformation he sought. But in that moment, he realized his struggle wasn't just with those in the company. It was with the very values he had instilled. He had to do what was right, even if it meant sacrificing everything. At the end of the long meeting, weary sighs and an uneasy silence settled over the room. No one voiced further objections, but no one truly supported Cameron either. He understood he would have to fight this battle alone, and that only strengthened his resolve. He couldn't turn back. The only path forward was to face the truth, no matter the cost. After the meeting ended, Cameron left the office and stepped out beneath a pitch-black sky, alone with the decisions he had made. He had embarked on a journey to change not just the company, but an entire system, and he knew, no matter how difficult, he couldn't stop. Cameron Westbrook felt like a soldier besieged in a war where every step could lead to disaster. The empire he had built over 2 decades was no longer just a pinnacle of power. It had become a covert battlefield where trust in anyone was absolute. After the transformative decisions he had made, Cameron's life entered a phase fraught with challenges. Things were no longer as simple as they once were, when his empire could trample over everything to advance. Now, resistance began seeping from within, from the very teammates who had joined him in building Westbrook Technologies from its Gen On early days. Right after the tense meeting with senior leadership, Cameron realized that those who had once stood by his side no longer saw him as their leader. Instead, they viewed him as weak, a man lost amid relentless external criticism. Richard, his closest friend and the one who had weathered countless storms with him, had become a cold shadow in the office. Richard's disappointment was palpable. His evasive gestures and skeptical questions about Cameron's goals made it clear he couldn't accept this shift. To him, it was a change that would only drag the company to ruin. Outside the company, Jasmine continued to press Cameron to confront the truth. Her words no longer stopped at critiquing his company. They had evolved into warnings about the broader society he had unwittingly helped sustain. She didn't just demand he reform the company. She wanted him to join a larger strategy, to topple an unjust system entrenched in major institutions, from politics to business. But this change couldn't be achieved simply. The powerful forces Cameron was up against weren't just within the company. They were the architects behind the decisions he had made over the years. In the days that followed, Cameron keenly felt he was living in a covert war. Every move he made was watched, every decision vulnerable to internal sabotage. Phone calls and meetings with partners were no longer safe. Leaks about the company's changes quickly reached rivals eager to exploit Cameron's hesitation and bring him down. Directors within the company began voicing policy disputes, questioning whether Cameron still possessed the steadfastness of a leader. Soon after, irregularities emerged in the company's financial operations. Cameron discovered that accounts were being tampered with, strange transactions executed without his knowledge. Key partners started pulling out of critical contracts, putting the company in a precarious position. The once pristine figures on financial reports now showed signs of instability. Employees, long affected by past racist policies and unfair treatment, began staging small protests. Though not yet powerful, these demonstrations were enough to unsettle Cameron. He realized that those he had once called allies in this economic war had turned against him. These weren't mere sidekicks from tough times. They were industry titans, always seeking to profit from systemic loopholes. Now, they didn't hesitate to capitalize on Cameron's indecision to seize control. The covert attacks intensified as misinformation about the company spread through the media and labor rights lawsuits erupted. These forces didn't just aim to topple Cameron. They sought to dismantle the entire empire he had built. With each passing day, the war grew fiercer. Cameron wasn't alone in this fight. Jasmine continued to support him, but she, too, recognized that what he faced went beyond company reforms. It was a protracted battle against society itself. The powers behind Westbrook Technologies wouldn't easily accept change. They were influential figures, politicians, and heads of other corporations, whom Cameron couldn't simply overthrow with internal shifts. They ramped up the pressure, threatening him with ever more ferocious assaults. Amid all this, Cameron gradually understood that this war wasn't just a clash between good and evil, justice and corruption. It was a struggle with himself. He had to stand firm and make a final choice: remain the leader of a shunned empire or rise as a fighter for justice, even if it cost him everything. The months that followed were a relentless battle. Cameron began implementing changes, not from within the company, but through personal decisions. He sought ways to reform the system from the outside, rallying support from human rights organizations and advocates for social justice. He confronted powerful entities willing to sacrifice anything to cling to their dominance. In this very war, Cameron realized that truth and justice didn't always prevail. But if he didn't fight, if he didn't change, the price wouldn't just be the company's collapse, but the profound loss of his own conscience. Cameron Westbrook stood alone in his office, gazing out the window as the sunset slowly descended. The city beneath him no longer shone as brightly as it once had. The towering buildings and bustling streets now seemed like ghosts, mirroring the emptiness he felt within. The empire he had built, with all its glamour and power, was crumbling bit by bit. The war Cameron had plunged into was not just a fight against corruption. It was a confrontation with the choices he had made over the years. The changes he had tried to enact, though driven by determination and good intentions, were far from easy. Facing those he once considered allies, now turned enemies, Cameron realized that the system he had helped create was too vast and too entrenched to be altered effortlessly. As news of Westbrook Technologies' collapse spread, rivals launched fiercer attacks. Major shareholders, no longer patient, began to withdraw, thrusting the company into peril. Negotiations to sell the company and deals with key partners gradually lost meaning as allegations of corruption, racism, and labor rights violations surfaced relentlessly. Cameron saw that all his efforts had amounted to failure. Yet what pierced his heart most wasn't the loss of the company. It was his inability to do anything to salvage the lives of those whose rights his company had stripped away. He thought of the impoverished workers who had toiled in horrific conditions, the families shattered by his misguided decisions. Guilt overwhelmed him, and he realized nothing could fully compensate for what he had done. In those darkest days, when everything seemed to fall apart, an unexpected event unfolded. A special meeting was convened to determine Westbrook Technologies' future. Insiders, including senior company leaders, strategic partners, and major shareholders, gathered to decide its fate. In that meeting, Cameron made a final decision no one could have foreseen. He entered the room with a stern demeanor, no longer the confident man atop a throne of power, but someone daring to face the truth. He hadn't come to negotiate or salvage the company. He came to expose every mistake, to take responsibility, and to accept the price he had to pay. His words rang out in the meeting room, not to defend the company or his reputation, but to speak the truth. I was wrong. We were wrong. We built an empire on exploitation and injustice. And now, I'll let this company fall if that's the only way for people to see we can't go on like this. Cameron hadn't anticipated the profound impact his words would have on those present. Some in the room began to show empathy. They no longer saw him solely as a failed leader, but as a man seeking redemption. The shareholders, typically obsessed with profit, unexpectedly softened their stance. A silence hung in the air, as if everyone there was reflecting on what Cameron had just said. But this shift didn't come easily. Powerful external forces, rivals poised to seize control, moved to exploit the opportunity. Legal assaults, investigations by authorities, and grave accusations against the company piled up. These forces had no intention of letting Cameron or anyone at the company survive this downfall. A fierce legal battle erupted, sparking bloody disputes over ownership and management. Amid this war, Cameron realized that the external attacks paled in comparison to the battles within him. He had sacrificed everything he had, but was it truly enough to atone for his sins? Long, stressful days passed, And finally, Cameron made a resolute choice. He would let it all go. He decided to sell off most of the company's assets, using the proceeds to compensate the disadvantaged workers and fund charities aiding society's oppressed. He no longer wanted wealth or power. He sought change from within to rebuild his life in a different way. As the story of Westbrook Technologies' collapse spread, it became more than a lesson in ambition and power. It was a reminder of accountability. Cameron couldn't revive the company, but he gave others a chance to mend the wrongs he had caused. The change didn't happen instantly, and not everyone trusted his actions. Yet, at least, Cameron found solace in doing right, in facing the consequences of his deeds. This unexpected outcome wasn't utter destruction, it was an awakening. Cameron Westbrook, once a man of power and wealth, became a fighter for justice, even at the cost of all he had possessed. He couldn't turn back, but at least he knew he had done what was right. Cameron Westbrook was no longer the powerful man standing atop a business empire. He no longer felt excitement when glancing at financial reports or pride when reading the enormous profit figures his company once achieved. Those things were now mere worthless fragments, behind which lay an empty, meaningless life. What he sought now wasn't money or power, but renewal, a way to atone for the mistakes he had made in the past. After letting go of everything, Cameron didn't return to the lavish lifestyle he had once known. Instead, he began rebuilding his life from what remained. He sold off most of the company's assets, channeling a substantial sum to aid the workers disadvantaged throughout Westbrook Technologies' rise. This money wasn't just used to compensate grieving families. It also funded initiatives for impoverished communities, people society had abandoned, whom he had overlooked in his race for profit. Cameron knew these actions couldn't instantly erase all his wrongs, but he felt it was the only way to ease the gnawing guilt he had carried for so long. He was no longer the man of an empire. He had become a fighter for justice and fairness, even though the path was fraught with hardship and trials. Yet the new path Cameron chose was far from easy. Those within the company, whom he had once led, didn't readily accept this transformation. They saw him as a failure, someone who had discarded everything they had painstakingly built. They couldn't fathom why a man who had it all would abandon power and wealth to pursue an uncertain, murky road. Meetings with shareholders and business partners inevitably turned cold, even hostile. They couldn't embrace the change, let alone understand that Cameron was no longer a businessman, but a person seeking redemption. Still, it was through these challenges that Cameron began to recognize the true value of relationships he had once taken for granted. Those he had considered partners and colleagues became outsiders in his journey of change. But in new relationships, he discovered sincerity and empathy he had never experienced before. Jasmine Riley, who had stood by him throughout this journey, remained his steadfast companion, encouraging and helping him through the darkest days. Even when he felt weary, even when he wanted to give up, Jasmine was the one who made him look back and keep moving forward. She wasn't just his guide in the fight against the company. She rekindled his belief in change. Under her guidance, Cameron didn't just engage in charity work. He collaborated with human rights organizations and joined community projects to support the oppressed. These projects weren't mere acts of goodwill. Cameron realized that change didn't come solely from donating money. It required altering long-standing societal systems. He began attending conferences and symposiums, where people like him could share experiences, learn, and collaborate to address social injustices. He was no longer a bystander, but part of a community, part of those fighting for justice. During this time, Cameron also worked to rebuild ties with the company's former workers. He sought to compensate those deceived by the company, while also striving to create a fair work environment where everyone had opportunities to grow and be treated as human beings. He realized that, though late, he could start anew. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future, beginning with the smallest actions. Not everyone agreed with these changes, however. Some within the company, those who had profited from corruption and injustice, resisted fiercely. They couldn't accept this sudden, incomprehensible shift and didn't hesitate to use every trick to undermine Cameron. False rumors and smear campaigns were unleashed to tarnish his image. But this time, Cameron felt no fear. He had faced far mightier forces before. These challenges couldn't make him retreat. With steady steps, Cameron not only transformed the company, but also shifted society's perception of business leaders. He proved that, even if late, anyone could change if they had the courage to face the truth. He couldn't erase his past sins, but he achieved something significant. He righted wrongs and helped others rise, just as he had pulled himself from the mire of corruption. The new path Cameron chose wasn't easy, but it was the only one he could take. He didn't seek forgiveness from anyone, but he found peace within himself. For society, and for those he had once harmed, his journey began to set an example for others who wished to change. Cameron Westbrook stood before his office window, gazing out at the city slowly bathed in the light of early morning. The city remained as crowded as ever, but he no longer felt swept up in its hustle. Everything now seemed smaller, simpler, far different from what he once perceived. He no longer viewed the city as a powerful entrepreneur, but as a man who had come to understand the true value of life. For years, Cameron had strived to build an empire he deemed great, but now he faced the inevitable consequences of the greed, deceit, and injustice he had unwittingly unleashed. He had harmed not only the workers, but also destroyed his own soul in the pursuit of power and wealth. Yet now, he knew nothing could undo those mistakes except doing what was right to make amends, to pay the price. The final days of Westbrook Technologies were drawing near. Everything was collapsing. The company's stock plummeted. Major partners withdrew one by one, and investigations into fraud, racism, and labor rights violations grew increasingly intense. Cameron knew that no matter what he did, what he had built would cease to exist. But what he could do was ensure that everything that had happened came to light and help those hurt along the way. At a pivotal trial, Cameron stepped in, not as a commanding CEO, but as a human facing justice. All eyes turned to him. Reporters, journalists, former company workers, all were present, watching how he would confront the actions he had set in motion. Cameron didn't shy away from their gazes. He knew this was the moment to face his mistakes. He didn't want to justify or explain. He simply wanted to stand up and speak the truth. When called, Cameron took the stand, his face devoid of the smugness or arrogance of old. He stood under the courtroom's glaring lights, yet felt no fear or pressure. Instead, he experienced an odd peace, a serenity he hadn't known amid years of maneuvering and calculation. His testimony wasn't a defense, it was a revelation. He recounted everything: the flawed decisions, how his company had upheld a racist system, and the injustices inflicted on thousands of workers exploited to enrich him and his co-founders. "We were wrong," Cameron said, his voice steady, free of evasion. "I was wrong. We built an empire on lies and the suffering of others. And now, I stand before justice to pay for what we've done." His words struck like lightning, silencing the room. The workers harmed by his company for years could now rise and look at him without bitterness. A man once a symbol of power and success now stood before justice, facing consequences he couldn't escape. The trial lasted a week, and throughout, Cameron didn't just face charges of corruption and racism. He witnessed the pain of the workers he had ignored. Witnesses, former employees, stood to tell of their miserable lives in the factories, dreams stolen, endless hours without health care, and families trapped in poverty, unable to earn enough to survive. In their stories, Cameron saw himself. He wasn't just the creator of those racist systems. He was the one who had unwittingly hurt people he once viewed as mere tools for profit. Children enduring deprivation, mothers unable to care for their kids due to relentless work, men denied chances for a better life. Their tales twisted his heart, but he couldn't turn back time. When the trial ended, Cameron wasn't forgiven, at least not in the public's eyes. His company was declared bankrupt, its remaining assets distributed to the victims. But what mattered was that he no longer lived in guilt or fear. He had stood up and faced the truth. That was the justice he had sought. After the trial, Cameron continued his work, not to amass wealth or preserve power. He joined charitable organizations, worked with impoverished laborers, and aided the oppressed. His investments shifted from factories and corporations to community funds, human rights groups, and education projects for poor children. Cameron understood that justice wasn't something he could achieve instantly, but at least he could walk a righteous path. He realized justice wasn't just about paying for mistakes. It came from living responsibly and fighting for a fair society. And though the road ahead was fraught with obstacles, Cameron knew he had found his true purpose in life. Justice had been repaid, not just because of what happened to the company, but because Cameron had the courage to change, to rebuild his life, and to pay for the wrongs he had committed. The story of Cameron Westbrook is not merely a journey of failure and collapse. It is a vivid testament to the awakening of conscience and the power of change. It is a tale of a long, challenging path where one must confront the mistakes of their past, but also a journey of recovery and the pursuit of justice. From the outset, this story poses a profound question about the cost of power and wealth. Cameron, with all his intelligence and determination, built a colossal tech empire, becoming a symbol of success. But that very empire was erected on a foundation of injustice, exploitation, and deceit. The narrative begins with a beautiful curtain of triumph, but gradually, the truth about the price of that success is unveiled. All the glamour was merely a facade hiding the darkness within, forcing Cameron into an unrelenting internal struggle. The first lesson this story imparts is about facing the truth, no matter how difficult. On his journey, Cameron didn't just confront business rivals. He faced himself. He had to muster the courage to admit his past mistakes, the decisions he made to sustain his empire. Confronting the truth is never easy, especially when it strikes at pride and self-esteem. Yet it was in accepting and facing that truth that Cameron began his process of transformation. The story also reflects a crucial lesson about the awakening of conscience. When the reality of racism, exploitation, and injustice in his company was exposed, Cameron could no longer live in denial. He couldn't remain indifferent to the consequences his company had inflicted on thousands of workers. This lesson underscores that every individual, regardless of their position of power, must take responsibility for their actions. One cannot persist in the shadows of greed without facing its impact on others. Another vital lesson is about change and resilience. Cameron didn't just transform himself. He tried to reform his company from within. Decisions to sell assets, compensate harmed workers, and contribute to charities couldn't fully erase past wrongs, but they helped him rediscover some meaning in life. This change didn't happen overnight, nor was it easy. He faced opposition from those within the company who had built the empire alongside him. They couldn't understand why he would abandon power and wealth for this path. Yet in that very transformation, Cameron found his true purpose, not power or money, but fairness and compassion. This story also serves as a reminder of the strength of justice. Justice doesn't always arrive swiftly, and sometimes achieving it demands a steep price. Cameron lost the empire he had painstakingly built and faced societal judgment and criticism. But the justice he sought wasn't vengeance or punishment. It was his genuine change and attempt to atone. Justice here isn't about winning a legal battle. It's about transformation in action and conscience. Another key lesson lies in confronting life's choices. Cameron once had all power, wealth, and admiration, but his past missteps led him down a path of suffering. This story emphasizes that the choices we make, whether in work or personal life, can have lasting effects on our future. Every decision, every action carries a cost, and we must be prepared to face the consequences. Cameron Westbrook's tale isn't one of perfection or flawless success. It's a story of awakening, of learning from mistakes and changing oneself. No one is immune to error, but what matters is whether we have the courage to rise and start anew after each fall. Cameron couldn't reclaim what was lost, but he found a new path, one of self-awareness and responsibility. In this journey, he discovered something he had never fully grasped before: inner peace. Finally, the deepest lesson this story offers is about forgiveness and redemption. To forgive oneself, one must recognize that the road to renewal is far from easy. Cameron paid with everything, but through that process, he learned to face himself and those he had harmed. Justice isn't just about compensating for mistakes. It's about changing actions and attitudes toward others. Only when we're ready to confront our errors and seek to mend them can we truly find peace and justice in life.